Deliver me from L.L. Bean.
Hey Ghost Heads, it's Heidi from Channeling Spirits, and today we will be taking a comprehensive look at what factors make a classic ghost story and how the 1988 dark comedy Beetlejuice found success in inverting every single one of them. In order to explain how Tim Burton flipped the genre, we'll be establishing the necessary stages many contemporary classics have followed to create a classic ghost story. Then, we will compare how Beetlejuice reverses each of those aspects. A bit of warning before we begin. Though the movies we will be talking about have been out for years, we'll undoubtedly be discussing spoilers. Many of these films are cinematic masterpieces, so if you haven't seen them, we highly recommend that you do. Before we can talk about the format ghost stories generally follow, it's important to discuss a template which many myths and legends adhere to. A consistent hero's journey, or monomyth, was first theorized by Joseph Campbell in his 1949 work, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. The novel compares several different myths throughout the world and lays out 17 stages all heroes endure through their varying stories. Not only does it illustrate the similar nature of these myths, but modern creators have also sought to specifically copy this model. One of the best-known examples is George Lucas while he was making Star Wars.
About 10 years ago, I set out to write a children's film. I had an idea of doing a modern fairy tale, stumbled across A Hero with a Thousand Faces. After reading more of Joe's books, I began to understand how I could do this.
In a similar way, many of our modern-day haunted house stories follow the same general beats. The hero's journey involves the protagonist being whisked off on an adventure and returning home with a tangible or intangible prize. However, a ghost story is about the gradual unraveling of the characters by the supernatural forces they are dwelling with. We will call this process the haunted descent. Like the hero's journey, the haunted descent has several stages and can be broken down into 3 acts. The first act involves setting the scene. We are introduced to the house in its haunted state, the individuals who will be residing there, and an ominous foreshadowing of the events to come. In the second act, the residents discover the first signs of supernatural activity, which may be met with denial or ignorance, but ultimately results in the realization that their house is haunted. This revelation causes them to call in an expert. The final act has a sensitive or susceptible individual possessed, which requires an exorcism and eventually results in some sort of peace. These 3 acts each have 3 stages within them. We will explore these 9 descending steps with examples from classic films and demonstrate how Beetlejuice also follows this format, but with its own creative inversion. What's important to note is these stages are merely a general guideline that many supernatural stories tend to follow. There are certainly examples of stories that have almost none of these steps, and we are by no means stating that a ghost story must have each stage, or any to be considered great. Of the films we present, some do not have every stage. Others focus more on certain aspects than others, and a few arrange their story in a different order than we present. Our aim is to compare similar threads throughout these stories and how they are flipped to form Tim Burton's uniquely entertaining film. Let's start with the first stage in the haunted descent, the house. It is one of the most crucial elements to a ghost story, almost always an older mansion, sometimes dilapidated. The house is a character in of itself. The grounds can play a role, but the ambiance it creates is crucial to setting the tone. The story will often begin immediately with its introduction, such as with The Amityville Horror, released in 1979. It details the aftermath of Ronald DeFeo Jr. murdering his whole family.
All shot in the bed's execution style.
Only the mother shot in the head.
Similarly, The Haunting, which came out in 1963, begins with the narrator discussing the disturbing history of Hill House.
Scandal, murder, insanity, suicide. The history of Hill House was ideal.
We are told it was built by Hugh Crane as a home for his wife who died upon arriving at the house when her carriage crashed into a tree. Death would follow those who lived there, with Crane's second wife mysteriously falling down the stairs, his elderly daughter dying in her nursery bed calling for her nurse, and the nurse eventually hanging herself. Contemporary viewers may recognize the name Hill House from the 2018 Netflix series The Haunting of Hill House, both of which are based on Shirley Jackson's 1959 novel. However, The Haunting is much closer to its source material, although some would say that The Haunting of Hill House is definitely better. Other stories, like Kubrick's classic The Shining, introduce the infamous Overlook Hotel at the beginning and gradually reveals the sordid history of those who have stayed there and some that have never left. Similarly, Ghostbusters presents Dana Barrett's gargoyle-guarded penthouse, nicknamed Spook Central, eventually unveiling its dreadful past.
Something terrible is about to enter our world, and this building is obviously the door.
While most ghost stories employ the notion of a once pristine old house that has fallen into disrepair, Beetlejuice does the opposite. Instead of being introduced to a dark manor amid a thunderstorm, the Maitlands' home is quite the opposite, bright white and nearly always seen during the day. Rather than decaying, it is being modernized under the questionably artistic hands of Delia Dietz. With the house firmly established, we are introduced to those who will reside in it with the move-in. The family or group of people moving in may be unaware of their supernatural entities that will plague them later on, such as Dana Barrett or the Freeling family in the 1982 thriller Poltergeist. The 2007 film Paranormal Activity tells a slightly different story where Katie neglects to mention her history of being pursued by a demon to her boyfriend Micah before moving in with him.
I understand where you come from. Just remember, too, that you didn't exactly warn me about this kind of stuff before we moved in together.
Others are told upfront about its history, as is the case with the Amityville Horror. A year after the DeFeo tragedy, George and Kathy Lutz are shown the house and, despite the murders, choose to buy it.
There's nothing like it on the market. Not at this price.
Jack Torrance in The Shining interviews for a job to be a winter caretaker for the hotel, while the rest of the staff is away for 5 months.
That's very good, Jack. Because for some people, solitude and isolation can of itself become a problem.
Jack is happy to accept the job and brings along his family, since it will give him a chance to be undisturbed while he works on his novel. For Dr. John Markway in The Haunting, he is fully aware of the dangers and insists he be allowed to investigate Hill House.
All my life, I've been looking for an honestly haunted house.
He brings along Theodora, a psychic, and Eleanor Lance, who had previously encountered a poltergeist as a child, to find evidence of the supernatural. But in Beetlejuice, the Maitlands are unaware that following their death, their house was sold. As opposed to an unexpected couple moving into a home only to be harassed by the dead, Beetlejuice has the dead harassed unexpectedly by a couple moving in.
We probably wouldn't mind sharing the house with people who were
more like you used to be.
With the protagonists moved into their menacing new dwelling, they are often given an explicit or subtle warning of the horrors to come. We call this next stage just that, the warning. With Jack Torrance, he is told accepting the job offer that a previous caretaker murdered his family.
Well, my predecessor in this job hired a man named Charles Grady as the winter caretaker. And he came up here with his wife and 2 little girls, I think about 8 and 10. And he had a good employment record, good references. And from what I've been told, I mean, he seemed like a completely normal individual. But at some point during the winter, he must have suffered some kind of a complete mental breakdown. He ran amok and he killed his family with an axe.
Despite the horrible tragedy, Jack is undaunted. In fact, in every instance, the warning is ignored, which results in disastrous consequences. Poltergeist showcases this with its infamous line, "They're here," signaling the events to come. Spielberg expertly crafts a happy California neighborhood that is gradually exposed to paranormal terrors. Harkening the days of coal miners,
I think I'm getting the black lung, Bob.
Diane Freeling literally finds the family canary dead.
Oh, shit. Tweety, couldn't you have waited for school day?
1973 horror staple, The Exorcist, also begins with an archaeological dig in northern Iraq where Father Marin comes face to face with a statue of Pazuzu, foreshadowing his encounter later. We also see Pazuzu's growing presence hinted in the defiled statue of the Virgin Mary. The Amityville Horror shows a similarly symbolic warning of the house's unholiness, as Father Delaney attempts to bless it, but is overcome by a horde of flies. The subtlety ends there, as he is literally told to get out. The encounter leaves him physically ill, and as he attempts to warn the Lutz, his phone call cannot connect, and he experiences another biblical plague, sores. In Paranormal Activity, Dr. Fredericks is a psychic that Katie invites over to assess the house. He informs the couple that they are dealing with a demon, a being separate from ghosts, and a field he is not comfortable with, advising that they speak with a demonologist. Micah has the brilliant idea to antagonize the demon, which Dr. Fredericks says in no uncertain terms to not communicate with.
And that's opening the door, inviting it in.
While Katie and Micah are warned by a living being to avoid the entity and seek help from a demonologist, Adam and Barbara are told by their dead caseworker Juno to deal with the living by themselves.
The intermediate interface chapter on haunting says it all. Get them out yourselves.
In fact, when the Maitlands ask about employing a bioexorcist, Juno insists that they do not want his help.
But I strongly suggest that you remove the Vietzes yourselves.
Following the warning, the characters see the next stage in the haunted descent, the signs. These little hints of unusual behavior are often ignored as well, but they become less easy to rationalize and disregard. In many instances, children have imaginary friends, which in a traditional setting would be normal. Here, they represent something more sinister, just like Regan and Captain Howdy.
You really don't want me to play, huh?
No, I do. Captain Howdy said no.
Amy Lutz and Jody.
Why didn't you unlock the door? You were Jackie knocking?
Jody wouldn't let me.
And Danny and Tony.
Tony, why don't you want to go to the hotel? I don't know.
Which is followed by Danny having a series of terrible visions and Jack waking from a nightmare about killing his family. Kathy Lutz also wakes up from a nightmare while their family experiences a slew of paranormal phenomena, including doors suddenly locking and flying off, windows smashing down, and ectoplasm emerging from their toilet.
Egon, your mucus.
Both the Lutz and the Freelings' dogs bark at unknown objects. The Freelings also experience glasses suddenly breaking, bent silverware, and stacked chairs.
You're right, no human being would stack books like this.
Dana Barrett arrives in her apartment to find her TV on, and then her eggs eerily cooking on the countertop. In The Exorcist, Chris McNeil constantly hears rats in the attic but cannot find them. When her daughter Regan uses a Ouija board, her behavior radically alters and becomes aggressive and antisocial. Despite Dr. Fredericks' insistence on not communicating with the demon, Micah taunts it with the Ouija board when it then bursts into flames. Like Regan, this invitation strengthens the entity whose footprints are exposed by the couple. In the first night at their stay in Hill House, Eleanor runs to Theodora's room where they hear relentless knocking at the chamber door, followed by the disturbing laughter of a little girl. In Beetlejuice, the Maitlands are awakened by a strange noise during the daytime, as opposed to the more traditional disturbances at night. When Adam and Barbara attempt to terrorize their intruders, they are either ignored or found fascinating by Lydia Dietz.
Aren't you scared?
With an ample amount of evidence, the residents come to the next step, the realization. They no longer deny the existence of the supernatural or finally understand their torments are otherworldly. After a barrage of tests, procedures, and treatments, Regan's doctors have few medical explanations for her behavior. Instead, they consider a non-traditional solution.
Do you have any religious beliefs?
No. What about your daughter? No. Why?
You ever heard of exorcism?
While some reach this conclusion as a last resort, others come to it when the supernatural being manifests itself. This is the case with the Freelings when their son Robbie is abducted by a possessed tree through his bedroom window. And while attempting to rescue him, their daughter, Carol Ann, is absorbed into a portal. Dana Barrett stumbles onto a similar portal when opening her refrigerator and sees a demonic beast staring back at her.
This voice said, Zool. And then I slammed the refrigerator door and I left. That was 2 days ago, and I haven't been back to my apartment.
Kathy Lutz also encounters a pair of red glowing eyes as her husband George goes to town hall and the library to discover the secrets of the grounds they live on. As with the other supernatural signs, this awareness is usually accompanied by horror and dread. However, when the Dietz are forced to dance the calypso, they discover Lydia was telling the truth about their spectral inhabitants. They react to this with excitement and plan to open an amusement park starring the ghosts. Faced with a force beyond their comprehension, the protagonists arrive at the next stage and call in the expert. This is an experienced or knowledgeable individual that lends support. Their expertise may come from having a supernatural power themselves, such as Dick Halloran, the head chef of the Overlook Hotel. Like Danny, Halloran has telepathic powers he refers to as
The shinin.
You mean shining?
Shh! You wanna get sued?
Other experts might wield spiritual power, such as Fathers Mirren and Kara's, or experience such as when Dr. Peter Venkman investigates Dana Barrett's apartment.
Well, are you sure you're using that thing correctly?
I think so, but...
Or Dr. Johann Avery's
I am Dr. Johann.
The demonologists Katie and Micah attempt to contact. In the Amityville Horror, the wife of George's business partner is sensitive to paranormal activity and initially refuses to enter the home. She discovers the house was built at the site of where a devil worshipper lived. Upon investigating the house, she locates a secret room with a passage to hell. Beetlejuice, on the other hand, is questioned on whether he has the skills to rid the house of the Dietz. Ultimately, the Maitlands choose not to employ him, and it is only in Lydia's desperation that he is actually summoned. With the expert brought in, the supernatural threat worsens and takes hold of an individual. This stage is known as the possession. Usually it is a character who is emotionally vulnerable, spiritually sensitive, or weakened by another vice. Possession takes place over time with the character eventually submitting. Throughout the haunting, we will see Eleanor still suffering from the recent loss of her invalid mother, who she cared for throughout her life. Hill House calls out to her, and she succumbs to its spell, trying to commit suicide off the same spiral staircase the nurse did. Katie also gradually falls prey to the demon that has been stalking her. She repeatedly stands up around 3 a.m. and stares at Micah while he sleeps for hours. The couple becomes emotionally worn down, which strengthens the demon and culminates with Katie being dragged out of bed and bitten. Like Katie, George Lutz repeatedly wakes up at 3:15 a.m. He obsessively checks on the boathouse. His demeanor becomes constantly aggravated, and he really enjoys his acts. Not as much as Jack, though.
Here's Johnny!
Jack also has his share of violent outbursts, and despite having given up on drinking, he indulges again when a ghostly bartender offers him one. Worried about Jack's instability, his wife Wendy checks on what he has been writing, only to find all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, written over and over. After being dragged down by demonic hands and dragged through a doorway, Dana has no semblance of her former self.
There is no Dana, only Zool.
And repeatedly tries to seduce Peter, believing him to be a fellow demon necessary to opening a bi-dimensional gateway. And while these characters emotionally and psychologically change, Regan's transformation is quite physical. Her body contorts and spasms while her face alters into a horrendous mirror of the innocent girl possessed. Traditional ghost stories have the entities intentionally take hold of an individual, but that isn't the case in Beetlejuice. Adam and Barbara are not possessed by the living per se, but they are powerless as Otho summons them. The result rapidly deteriorates them, and Otho is unable to stop the process.
It's too late, Charles. I'm sorry.
As the paranormal entity desperately grabs onto its victims, the expert will face it in a climactic confrontation in the next step, the exorcism. With Regan's case, this is quite literally an exorcism performed when Father Merrin is asked to face off against the demon. The encounter costs Merrin his life and forces Karas to sacrifice himself to save Regan. Ghostbusters technically exorcise Dana Barrett by banishing Gozer when they cross the streams. They accept that they also may have to be sacrificed, but miraculously survive the massive explosion atop Spook Central. Tangina Barons discovers the portal's source is in the children's bedroom closet while it exits out into the living room. Tethered to the physical plane, Tangina directs Diane into the other dimension to find her daughter. She manages to rescue Carol Ann, and Tangina declares the house clean. Living up to his bolsters about being a bioexorcist, Beetlejuice saves the Maitlands, murders 2 partygoers, and scares Otho away. While most exorcisms force individuals into selfless sacrifice and have them rewarded by the deed itself, Beetlejuice demands payment by marrying Lydia. With the exorcism over, the final stage in the haunted descent comes with peace. This, however, does not necessarily mean a happy ending. It may be peace for some at the cost of others' life, or peace for the house and its ghosts. With the haunting, this comes after Eleanor kills herself by driving into the same tree that Hugh Crane's wife did. She finds peace now being part of Hill House while the others find it by getting out alive. George Lutz finds he has an uncanny resemblance to Ronald DeFeo, and before he can repeat the pattern of murdering his family, they abandon their house, belongings, and all. In the midst of a thunderstorm, the family frantically drives away. The same is true for the Freelings, who escape in almost the exact setting. Believing they are free of the poltergeist, they still intend to move out. When the spirits attempt to capture Carol Ann a second time, corpses erupt from the ground. Peace only comes to the house when it collapses into a vortex. After transforming into a terror dog, Dana is heroically rescued following the destruction of Gozer. But other stories end in death, such as Fathers Mirren and Karas, or Jack as he stalks Danny and Wendy through the snow. In a traditional ghost story, there is almost always an absolute victor to who owes the house. The supernatural forces might be totally removed, allowing the characters to prosper quietly, or the residents might be driven out by malevolence or worse, become a part of those who permanently dwell there. Of course, Beetlejuice breaks the mold. Peace is not found by either the residents or the supernatural, but rather between the two. The Maitlands and Dietz find a way to coexist, ending not with a thunderstorm, but a bright sunny day. Beetlejuice is no doubt a unique film, with a young Tim Burton's dark aesthetic juxtaposed with Harry Belafonte's upbeat Caribbean chorus. It is one of the few examples where breaking all the rules results in a wonderfully enjoyable film. By taking a ghost story and turning it on its head, it creates a narrative both familiar and fresh. If you enjoyed this video and think we deserve it,
You bunch of losers! You're working with a professional here!
please subscribe. I'm Heidi with Channeling Spirits, and thanks for watching. What a great story.